The Church of Christ was presided over and led by apostles who were special witnesses that Jesus is the Christ and who were recognized as general authorities who were responsible to keep the worship of the Savior true and pure, and the church membership was served by men who were called by revelation to these apostles to serve as pastors, high priests, 70s, elders, bishops, priests, teachers, and deacons. These were all the offices in the church in the time of the Savior. There is no evidence that the presiding council of the church, the 12 apostles, existed after the death of those apostles. Neither is there a record of anyone being ordained as apostles other than the few men mentioned in the New Testament. By the end of the first 100 years after the death of Jesus, it appears that all the apostles had died. Church history written at the time tells us that wherever a unit of the church was organized, it was organized by an apostle who prayerfully sought revelation to help him select the bishop who was to lead and serve that church. This was entirely unpaid service given as a gift to both the Lord and to the members of that church. During their lives, the apostles alone were recognized as the presiding officers over the whole church, and the members of each church still had the right to vote to accept or reject the proposed bishop as their presiding officer. Common consent of the members was deeply respected in the time of the apostles and entirely rejected when the Roman Catholic Church was in full force. The apostles did not appoint men to any position and then announce that appointment. Bishops had normal jobs, were self-supporting, and had help from other men who also served the members of their congregation without pay. After the apostles had died, bishops, usually those in the bigger cities, nominated men to be new bishops in the smaller towns and villages close by. In the beginning, each church or branch was looked after by a local leader with help from a number of faithful members, and no church even tried to claim that they were in any way better or had a right to tell another church what to do. The only slight exception to that was the great respect that was given to those churches that were personally organized by the apostles and those leaders who were ordained by or personally knew the apostles. Obviously, as time went by, there were fewer of these around. These leaders were highly thought of, but were not considered to have any authority more than to just serve their local congregation. Throughout the first 100 years and the greater part of the second 100 years after the time of the apostles, the Christian churches were totally independent of each other. Each Christian church was basically a self-governing group, governed by its own rules of worship, which were approved by the members. All the bishops had the same authority to serve those people in their local congregation, never anything more than that. Late in the 200s and throughout the 300s, the bishops in the major cities of the Roman Empire, like Alexandria, which is in Egypt, Constantinople, which is now what we would call, which is in Turkey, and Rome, argued, constantly with one another about who had the right to exercise more authority to decide on new doctrines for the whole church. The bishops over the larger churches, whether in major cities or the most populated provinces, also started calling themselves by the title of metropolitan, which was meant to give themselves a title so they would be seen by some people as being superior to just the ordinary bishops in the ordinary towns. From the 200s onward, there started to be occasional church councils in Greece where the bishops would get together and talk about things. And later on, these council meetings were held in other parts of the Roman Empire. These councils had no God-given right to do or decide anything, but they started to try to exercise power over and give commands to all the churches, so that the members of the local church no longer were recognized as having even the right to accept or reject people nominated to be their bishop or other officers. That meant that the office of a bishop could be given to someone who had never lived in a city before and who was not known to the people and could, and often did, use the office of bishop to use people in many ways, take advantage of them, and to make themselves rich by taking offerings and donations for their own personal use instead of having a job and being self-supporting. That level of unrighteous power and control led to many abuses. Leaders were often arrogant and acted as though they were gods in the government of the church. More changes came in the 300s and later, and there are records of some people known as subdeacons, acolytes, ostiars, readers, exorcists, and copiates, none of which existed in the church as organized by the apostles or the Savior. Pride was everywhere. If you were a subdeacon, for instance, church law said that you were forbidden to sit down in a chair in the presence of someone who was a deacon, unless that deacon said it was okay with him. It was about the same with every other position in the church. It's sort of like being in school and the kindergarten kids can't sit down unless the kids in grade 1 say it's okay. I mean, it's about that silly. Eventually, the Bishop of Rome, the city of the emperors and the place where so much of the worldly power of the Roman Empire was centered, dared to claim that he was the supreme bishop over the whole church in all the world. It is claimed even today that the original small church in Rome, and it would have been a small church of maybe a few dozen people when it was originally organized, had been organized by the apostles Peter and Paul. Even if that was true, and there is no proof of that, it is just a tradition, the claim that the apostle Peter was the first bishop in Rome is a story with absolutely no truth to it. It is a fairy tale. Only those people who know nothing about the office of apostles and bishops could possibly believe this. Saying Peter was the Bishop of Rome makes about as much sense as saying the President of the United States is basically also the Mayor of Washington, D.C. They are two totally different kinds of things with two totally different sets of responsibilities. Apostles never, and I want to repeat this, never served as bishops in any church at any time. You want an understanding of what the responsibility of the apostles was, you can get a brief summary by reading Acts chapter 6 and understand that the apostles realized that shortly after the death of the Savior, when they were expected to look after the needs of the members of the church in Jerusalem, that the apostles recognized that they had a much greater responsibility than, as one of them wrote, to wait on tables, and that their greatest responsibility was to bear witness of Jesus Christ to all the world and be traveling witnesses of Jesus Christ. You can go back to Acts chapter 6, which I have read and commented on, and I've dealt with more of this there. The apostles essentially had a meeting and called 7 just men to look after the worldly and spiritual needs of the local church in Jerusalem. The names of these men are mentioned in that chapter, and it appears as though a man named Stephen was called as the leader to serve the members of the church in Jerusalem. The apostles would have found some good man to be bishop in Rome, but it never would have been Peter or Paul or any of the other apostles. The apostles understood that they had far more important responsibilities than to look after just a local congregation, no matter where that congregation was. When the Bishop of Rome claimed he was the ultimate authority, the other bishops did not agree that the Bishop of Rome was the head of the church, and the claim of the bishops of Rome, or popes as they came to be known, was not accepted. And in the early 300s, when Constantine made Constantinople the capital of the empire, the Bishop of Constantinople claimed he had as much right to lead the whole church as did the Bishop of Rome. The dispute divided the church between East and West, and for 500 years the bickering and arguments grew more and more intense, until in 855 AD, the Bishop of Constantinople, known as the Patriarch, excommunicated the Bishop of Rome, said that members of the whole church were not required to follow the Bishop of Rome or obey the Bishop of Rome, and that the Bishop of Rome was not living worthy of being a bishop, that he was grossly sinning, and that the Bishop of Rome was no longer part of the church. The Bishop of Rome did not like that, and shortly after that was done, he sent 2 men to Constantinople, and they waited in the middle of Sunday Mass until a specific point in the Mass, and just at that part, these men rushed up with a large piece of parchment and threw down that document from the Roman Pope, and it was an excommunication of the Bishop of Constantinople by the Bishop of Rome. Pretty childish stuff.